All right. Hi, guys. This is the long awaited feature of my mom. She is now reading chapter 3 of The Assault. Get so hyped.
Hey guys, it's Mrs. Gimmelstein here, and I'm so excited to be reading to you from the book The Assault. And I'm going to be reading chapter 3. So, welcome to, I don't even know what we might call this, my chapter episode, possibly. All right, chapter 3 begins on page 31. Groping, he reached for the cot. All about him, he could feel the presence of the man who must be in there somewhere. He folded his hands in his lap and listened to the voices in the hall. A bit later, he heard Boots walking up the stairs, and all grew quiet. Now he heard the other one breathing. "Why are you here?" The gentle voice of a woman. Suddenly, it was as if a great danger had been averted. He opened his eyes wide to see, but the darkness filled them like black water. Now, in the other cells, he could hear muffled voices. "They set our house on fire." As he said it, he too could hardly believe there should be nothing left but a smoldering ruin between hideaway and home at last. It took a while before she answered. "Why did they? Did it happen just now?" "Yes, ma'am." "Why?" "In revenge. A fellow had been shot, but we had nothing to do with it. We weren't allowed to take anything along." "Oh, shit," she said. Then, after a while, "Jesus, were you maybe at home alone?" "No, with my father and mother and my brother." He noticed that his eyes were closing all by themselves. He opened them wide, but it made little difference. "Where are they now?" "I don't know." "Did the Germans take them away?" "Yes, at least my father and mother." "And your brother?" "He escaped. He wanted—" It was the first time that he had to cry just a little. "Now, look at me." He was ashamed, but he couldn't help it. "Come and sit next to me." He stood up and felt his way step by step in her direction. "Yes, here I am," she said. "Put out your hand." He touched her fingers. She took hold of his hand and pulled him close. On the cot, she embraced him with one arm and with her other hand pressed against his head against her breast. She smelled of sweat, but also of something else, something sweetish that he couldn't identify. Maybe it was perfume. Within the darkness, there was a second darkness in which he heard her heart pound, really much too hard for someone who was just comforting someone else. As he calmed down, he began to see a pale strip of light under the door and kept his eyes focused on it. She must have caught a glimpse of him when he entered. She draped her blanket around the two of them and held him firmly against her. She was not as warm as the stove upstairs, yet at the same time she was so much warmer. Once more tears welled in his eyes, but now in a different way. He would have liked to ask her why she was in prison, but didn't dare. Perhaps she had been dealing on the black market. He heard her swallow. "I don't know your name," she whispered, "and I shouldn't know it. You cannot know mine either, but will you never forget one thing for the rest of your life?" "What's that?" "How old are you?" "Almost 13, ma'am." "Oh, stop calling me ma'am. Listen, they'll try and make you believe all kinds of things, but you must never forget that it was the Krauts who burned down your house. Whoever did it, and not anyone else." "Of course I know that," said Anton, a little offended. "I saw it with my own eyes, after all." "Yes, but they did it because the pig had been liquidated, and they'll blame the underground and say they were forced to do it. They'll tell you that the underground knew what would happen, and therefore the underground is responsible." "Oh," said Anton, drawing himself up a little and trying to formulate what he thought about it. "But if that's the case, then no one's ever at fault. Then everyone can just do as they please." He felt her fingers caressing his hair. "Do you happen to know, by the way," she began hesitantly, "what that fellow's name was?" "Plogue," he said. Quickly, her hand covered his mouth. "Quiet." "Fake Plogue," he whispered. "He was with the police, a dirty collaborator." "Did you see him?" she asked softly. "Was he really dead?" Anton nodded. He realized that she could not see him, could at most feel him, and said, "As a doornail." Once more, the bloodstains in the snow were there in front of his eyes. "I'm in his son's class. He's also called fake. He heard her take a deep breath. You know, she said after a while, if those underground people hadn't done this, Plogue wouldn't have murdered many more. And then she pulled her arm away and began to sob. It frightened Anton. He wanted to comfort her, but didn't know how. He sat up and carefully reached out till he felt her hair, thick, springy hair. Why are you crying? She took his hand and pressed it against her heart. It's all so horrible, she said in a choking voice. The world is hell, hell. I'm glad it's almost over now. I can't take it anymore. Under the palm of his hand, he felt her soft breast, a strange softness such as he had never felt before, but he didn't dare remove his hand. What's almost over? She took his hand in hers. From her voice, he could tell that she had turned to face him. The war. The war, of course. Just a few more weeks and it will all be over. The Americans are at the Rhine and the Russians are at the Oder. For sure? How do you know? She said she had said it with total conviction, whereas at home he had only heard vague rumors that seemed to promise one thing and then turned out to mean another. She didn't answer. Though the strip of light under the door was very faint, now he could just see the outline of her hair and body, her loose, somewhat wild mass of hair, the place where she sat, an arm approaching him. Do you mind if I touch your face so I can make out what you look like? Softly, her cold fingertips caressed his forehead, his eyebrows, cheeks, nose, and lips. He sat motionless, his head slightly tilted back. He felt that this was something very solemn, a kind of initiation, something they might do in Africa. All of a sudden, she pulled her hand back and moaned. What's the matter? He asked, frightened. Nothing. Never mind. Now she sat bent over. Do you hurt? Really, it's nothing. Honest. She straightened and said, A few weeks ago I was in an even darker place than this. Do you live in Heemstede? Don't ask. It's better for you not to know a thing about me. You will understand later, all right? Sure. Then listen. Tonight there's no moon, and yet it's very bright. But that time it was cloudy, and there was no snow yet. I had gone to visit a friend in my neighborhood, and we sat and talked. I did not leave him until the middle of the night, long after curfew. It was so dark that no one would be able to see me. I know the neighborhood by heart, and walked home feeling my way along the walls and fences. I couldn't see a thing. I might as well have had no eyes. I had taken off my shoes so as not to make any noise. I really saw absolutely nothing, but all along I knew exactly where I was. At least, so I thought. I visualized everything in my memory. I had walked along here at least 1,000 times. I knew every corner, every hedge, every tree, every stoop, everything. And suddenly, I lost it. Nothing fitted anymore. I felt a bush where there should have been a windowsill and a lamp post where there ought to be a garage exit. I took a few more steps and couldn't feel anything more. I was still standing on the cobblestones, but I knew that a moat was somewhere near, and I was afraid I might fall into it if I took another step. I crept around on hands and knees for a while. I didn't have any matches or a flashlight. Finally, I just sat down and waited for dawn. Can you imagine how alone I felt? Did you cry? Asked Anton and held his breath. It was as if here in the pitch dark he could see whatever had been invisible then too. Not exactly, she said with a laugh, but I was scared, believe me, perhaps even more by the silence than by the darkness. I knew that there were lots of people all about, but everything had disappeared. The world stopped at my skin. My fear had nothing to do with the war anymore. Besides, I was terribly cold. And then? What do you suppose? I was just sitting on the street right in front of my own house. Just imagine, in 5 steps I was home. Something like that happened to me once, said Anton, who had completely forgotten where he was and why, when I was staying with my uncle in Amsterdam. That must have been some time ago. Last summer when the trains were still running. I think I'd had a bad dream. I woke up and wanted to go out to the bathroom. It was pitch black. At home, I always step out of my bed on the left side, but here there was suddenly a wall. On my right, where the wall usually is, there wasn't anything. I was scared stiff. It was as if the wall was much harder and thicker than an ordinary wall, and on the other side, where there was no wall, it seemed like a canyon. And then did you cry? Sure, of course. What else? And then your aunt or your uncle turned on the light and you remembered where you were? Yes, my uncle did. I was sitting up in bed and shh, steps came down the stairs. She put her arm around him again and listened, motionless. Voices in the hall, a rattle of keys. Briefly, there was a sound that Anton could not identify. Then, a sudden cursing and the dull thud of a beating. Someone was being dragged along the hall, while someone else was left swearing in the cell. With a loud iron clang, the door fell closed. In the hall, the man was being beaten or kicked. He screamed. More boots came pounding down the stairs, more screaming, after which it sounded as if the man was being dragged upstairs. It grew quiet. Someone laughed. They heard nothing more. Anton was trembling. Who was that? He asked. I don't know. I haven't been here long either. Those bastards. Thank God they'll all end up in the gallows, and sooner than you think. Believe me, the Russians and the Americans will make short shrift of them. Let's think about something else, she said, turning toward him and stroking his hair with both hands. While we still can. What do you mean? Well, while they still leave us together in here. Tomorrow they'll let you go. And you? Maybe not, she said, as if there were a possibility that tomorrow they might set her free also. But with me, too, everything will be all right in the end. Don't worry. What shall we talk about? Or are you tired? Do you want to sleep? Not me. Good. We've been talking all the time about the dark. Shall we talk about the light? Fine. Just imagine lots of light, sun, summer. What else? The beach. Yes, before it was full of bunkers and barricades, the dunes, the sun shining in a dune hollow. Do you remember how blinding that could be? You bet I do. And how the branches lying in there always bleached by the sun. Suddenly, without transition, she began to talk as if to a third person in the cell. Light, yes, but light is not always light. I mean, a long time ago, I wanted to write a poem comparing light to love. No, I mean love to light. Yes, that's another possibility, of course. You could also compare light to love. Maybe that's even more beautiful, for light is older than love. Christians say it's not so, but then they're Christians. Or are you a Christian? I don't really think so. In the poem, I wanted to compare love to the kind of light you sometimes see clinging to trees right after a sunset, the magical sort of light. That's the kind of light people have inside them when they're in love with someone. Hate is the darkness. That's no good. And yet we've got to hate the fascists and then and that's considered perfectly all right. How is that possible? It's because we hate them in the name of the light. I guess whereas they hate only in the name of darkness, we hate hate itself, and for this reason, our hate is better than theirs. But that's why it's more difficult for us. For them, everything is very simple, but for us, it's more complicated. We've got to become a little bit like them in order to fight them. So we've become a little bit unlike ourselves. But they don't have that problem. They can go away with us without any qualms. We first have to do away with something inside ourselves before we can do away with them. Not them. They can simply remain themselves. That's why they're so strong. But they'll lose in the end because they have no light in them. The only thing is, we mustn't become too much like them, mustn't destroy ourselves altogether. Otherwise, they'll have won in the end. She gave a brief moan. Before he could speak, she continued. He didn't understand a word she was saying, but he was flattered that she would be talking to him as to a grown-up. And there's something else about that kind of light. Whenever someone is in love with someone else, they always say that that person they love is very beautiful, physically or mentally or both. Often, other people can't see this at all, and they're usually right. But when people are in love, they're always beautiful, for in loving they are lit up by the light. There's a man who loves me and finds me very beautiful, which I'm not at all, really. He's the beautiful one, even though in many ways he's terribly ugly. And I'm beautiful too, but only because I'm in love with him, though he doesn't know it. He thinks I'm not, but I do love him. Now you're the only one who knows it, even though you don't know who I am and who he is. He has a wife and 2 children about your age. They need him just as you need your father and mother." Suddenly she was silent. "Where do you suppose my father and mother are?" Anton asked softly. "They're probably locked up too somewhere. I'm sure you'll see them tomorrow." "But why are they in another place than I am?" "Why, indeed? Because we're dealing with monsters, and because the whole thing is a big heap of ruins. The Krauts are just keeping busy. They're shitting in their pants at the moment. But don't you worry. I'm much more concerned about your brother." As he ran away, he picked up Plog's gun, Anton said, hoping this would not strike her as too terrible. A few seconds went by before she said, "For Christ's sake." He could tell by her voice that this was somehow fatal. What had happened to Peter? Suddenly, he could take no more. He slumped against her and instantly fell sound asleep.